Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Royal Trail Museum Speaker Series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Caleb Brown. I'm one of the curators here at the Royal Trail Museum, and I'll be your host today. Today, the Royal Trail Museum and its cooperating society are pleased to welcome Dr. Kiersten Formoso. Kiersten is originally from New York City, but grew up in New Jersey. Her interest in natural history was sparked by her upbringing in an Appalachia-adjacent rural community. She obtained her BSc in Ecology and Evolution and Natural Resources from Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. She later obtained her PhD in Earth Science from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where she studied the controls of ancestral terrestrial morphology on land-to-sea transformations. Kiersten is currently Presidential Postdoctoral Fellow at Rutgers University in New Jersey and a Research Associate at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. She has broad research interest in how animals, locomotion, and morphology constrain or enable evolution into new environments, particularly secondarily aquatic radiations. Kiersten does fieldwork in Utah and New Mexico, but soon hopes to expand to fieldwork in Montana's Bear Paw Formation, looking for mosasaurs. Kiersten was a scientific consultant for both seasons of the recent Apple TV series Prehistoric Planet, and in 2023 was named to Forbes 30 Under 30 for Science. Today, Kiersten will present her talk titled Going for a Swim, Influences of Terrestrial Ancestry on the Land-to-Sea Transformation. So without further delay, here is Dr. Kiersten Formoso.
Thank you so much, Caleb, for that lovely introduction. It's always so weird to hear kind of my life story summarized, but I really appreciate that. I'm really excited to be here in Drumheller. I actually was here last September for a little bit, and I thought, I need to get back here. And then Caleb came calling a few months ago, do you want to be part of our speaker series? And of course, I said yes. So thank you so much for the invite. I love this museum. The people on Zoom, as I understand it, can't actually see me up here on stage. So this is a nice photo. For the people on Zoom, that's what I look like. I always like to preface this that I'm very short. So picture this picture on a really short person, and then you got me speaking on stage. But all right, so I'm going to kind of get right into it. And so I'll kind of ask this rhetorical question of, what do all of these animals share? And so the animals from top left to bottom left are going to be mosasaurs. In the top left corner, pinnipeds. So pinnipeds are going to include seals, sea lions, and walruses. On the bottom right, we have orcas, which are going to be toothed whales, but cetaceans, so whales broadly. And then on the bottom left, we have plesiosaurs. In this case, this picture of an elasmosaur, not too dissimilar for something like Alberta nectes, which you have here at this museum from Alberta. And so what they all share in common is that they are secondarily aquatic amniotes. And so we'll go kind of through each of these words for you to bring home exactly what that means. But you can probably guess already by looking at the silhouettes of some probably very familiar animals and probably maybe some weird animals that are not familiar. But so this is a story of sea to land, back to sea. That started a long time ago, kind of when these first walking fish, these first tetrapods came onto land. And so this animal here is something called Tiktaalik, kind of one of the more famous fishopods, if you will, that eventually gave rise to groups of tetrapods. And so this is kind of the tetrapod family tree, simply. So it's going to include animals like amphibians, so that's going to be salamanders and frogs, but then other tetrapods like mammals, showing here you are here, and then animals like reptiles, which is going to include lizards, crocodilians, dinosaurs, including birds. But so marine tetrapods is the common phrase that people use to often describe secondarily aquatic amniotes. I like the term amniotes over tetrapods because I find amniotes to be a little bit more accurate for what we actually see that made these major transformations. And so an amniote is just an animal that is defined by something called an amniotic egg. The amniotic egg is this really incredible evolutionary innovation that essentially allowed tetrapods to take the water away from the water. So amphibians are heavily tied to aquatic environments for their reproduction. They never truly dissociated from aquatic environments the way that tetrapods did. And the amniotic egg is this incredible innovation that led to this group of tetrapods called amniotes. And so secondarily aquatic amniotes are going to be amniotes that went back into aquatic environments. So they went back into the water after being out on land for a couple million years. And then amniotes are really going to be reptiles and mammals. So secondarily aquatic amniotes are best described as marine reptiles and marine mammals. I am very grateful to study both. And so these secondarily aquatic transformations, these secondarily aquatic invasions are captured by this incredible transformation in morphology from this terrestrial animal to highly marine. So this shows on the left you have whales, and whales are hoofed mammals. I always like to express that. They're artiodactyls. They're split-toed hoofed mammals. They're in the same family as camels, pigs, deer, antelope, etc. So that's a really fun fact. And mosasaurs are lizards. I think mosasaurs being lizards is a little bit more obvious than whales being related to things like pigs and deer and hippos. But these are kind of their evolutionary affinities before they went into aquatic environments, and these trees show their very steady progression into the water. And so, little anatomy break, because these are some of the terms I'm going to be using a lot in this talk. So we have two skeletons as tetrapods. Actually, fish have it too, but theirs is a little bit different. We have an axial skeleton, which is best described as kind of your main central axis. That includes your skull, your vertebrae, and your ribs. And then we have our appendicular skeleton, which is going to be the limbs and the limb girdles. So our scapula, our pelvis, and then our legs and hands attached to those. So I'm going to be saying axial skeleton a lot, and I want you to think of kind of the main axis, mostly vertebrae. And then I'm going to say appendicular skeleton, think of the limbs and their attachments. So I'm going to start off with kind of a summary on ancestral terrestrial locomotion. Even though this title is definitely dedicated to swimming things, it's really important to understand the kind of starting points of those swimming things with regards to the rest of my talk and eventually sharing my kind of cool research with you all. So this is kind of a smattering of terrestrial animals and how they locomote on land. There are lots of other examples I could have thrown up here, but I didn't want to give you slides upon slides of GIFs of all these different animals. But so we can see kind of mammal locomotion on the top, exemplified by a wolf and a horse, and then we can see kind of this reptilian locomotion. So we know what these animals look like when they walk, but there are words for what these different locomotion styles are and these different postures. So land posture is kind of a major thing throughout evolution of amniotes. So when animals first came onto land, when they invaded, with tetrapod descendants, they were going to be kind of in this sprawling posture, very derived from essentially fish limbs that evolved to support the body on land. So most animals pretty much started out with this wide stance with the legs splayed out to the side. And then eventually through evolution, for some clades, but not all, an upright posture evolves, something that you would see in like us humans, a dog, a horse, and on the reptile side, animals like dinosaurs very notably evolved this upright posture. Then something kind of like in the middle. So it's not two extreme bookends. There's kind of a spectrum of posture. Crocodilians are really cool because they can do this like high walk, but they can also do this sort of belly crawl. So in between, but this is kind of the span of posture, and these different postures are going to result in different types of locomotion on land. And so this is that sprawling stance from kind of the front and showing kind of the way the legs are like a pillar underneath their body, the way the limbs on the top limb bone is going to anchor into the girdle is going to be different compared to the sprawling animal. So this is just a general anatomical comparison of what the bones are going to look like on the inside. And so on the top and the axial skeleton, this is a really, really cool figure from Bob Seary. He does really phenomenal work on lizard breathing and lizard locomotion. So you can see how much lateral bending of the spine there is when this sprawling lizard is walking. Look at the legs like really wide out, and the ribs are going to be bending a lot. Now contrast this kind of sprawling view of locomotion with this deer, very elegant, but it's not really moving its spine a lot. There's very minimal axial movement, maybe a little bit up and down, but in general, it's moving very ski line with the limbs, and there's not a lot of rotation. And I can do that too. Like I can walk across this stage right now, and my spine is really not moving. I'm able to walk and move my limbs and move my body without a lot of axial movement. And so that's one of the defining things really between an upright animal and a sprawling animal. There are other things, but those are the immediate locomotion observations that I've made that kind of inspired a lot of my dissertation work. And so when you look at mammals and how mammals got to that point, This is an early synapsid on the bottom right called a Dilophosaurus. This animal looks kind of like a reptile, but it is more closely related to you and me and any pet mammals you might have at home. And eventually you get kind of the modern mammal axial skeleton, which has a lot of vertebral regionalization. Those regions are shown by colors, a very distinct lumbar region, as opposed to something more like a lizard, which, believe it or not, would be similar to the bottom right with very minimal regionalization in the spine. So these are some of the differences in the axial skeleton between mammals and reptiles that are going to be relevant to locomotion. And so these two types of postures and the resultant locomotion gave rise to many groups of secondarily aquatic amniotes differently. So on the upright posture side, you can see, again, some of those familiar silhouettes. You have cetaceans like whales and dolphins, pinnipeds, so seals, sea lions, and walruses. And then I put penguins there because penguins are going to be avian dinosaurs. They were ancestrally upright. They're still upright, so they count as kind of an upright swimming result. And then on the right side, the sprawling side, you're going to have kind of your classic marine reptiles, sea turtles, ichthyosaurs, mosasaurs, and even sea snakes. The sea snakes evolved without legs, but ancestrally they would have been sprawling lizards. So these two postures have a pretty solid distribution of secondarily aquatic amniotes. And so now I've kind of summarized the terrestrial locomotion, but now let's take a look at the aquatic locomotion. So something's walking on land, it evolves to go into aquatic environments. How is it going to swim when it's in the water? So there's appendicular swimming locomotion. So that's when the limbs are actually going to be used as the propulsive surface. So in the case of sea lions, they're incredibly maneuverable. By the way, they are essentially flying underwater, like they actually generate lift with their forelimbs, and they can turn on a dime. This sea lion is probably experiencing about 5 Gs, like when it turns really fast, which is incredible. Then you have sea turtles on the bottom right, which are going to be employing their front flippers and kind of this half lift, half rowing kind of locomotion. Their hind limbs aren't really doing much but maneuvering. On the top right, it's just kind of an possible idea kind of made famous by the old BBC Walking with Dinosaurs series on how plesiosaurs swam. We don't really know. It's probably not like this, but all we know is that they had 4 equal-sized flippers and they were definitely using them to swim. How they were, I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But so this is appendicular swimming. They're using their limbs attached to their limb girdles to generate propulsion in the water. And so that is going to be contrasted, of course, with axial swimming. So this humpback whale is swimming with its main body axis. Muscles along the vertebrae are moving the body up, down, passing a wave from the front to the back, and it's going to be propelled forward when that tail fluke is going to hit the water and kind of push it. Same thing with this dugong on the right. Dugongs are in a group called sirenians. They're related to manatees and sea cows. And then on the bottom left, there are some appendicular swimmers in there. You can see the plesiosaurs, but I want to draw your attention to the mosasaur, which is swimming with its big upright tail fin. Same deal, though. A wave's being passed down the body. It's undulating, and it's moving forward. So that's going to be the difference between axial and appendicular swimming. And of course, there's going to be an in-between. So this is a seal. This is a true seal. The clade is going to be phocids. So again, your classic seals, leopard seals, harbor seals, as opposed to sea lions. They have this weird thing where they're definitely getting propulsion off the surfaces of their hind limbs, but you can see a lot of axial movement too, hopefully, like their lumbar region, their lower back, is really moving that along. So again, evolution is really cool, but it's not very discrete. There's always going to be exceptions in between, something that shows kind of the spectrum. So that's the in-between. And so this GIF is really useful because I can show, again, appendicular swimming and axial swimming in one. So again, the plesiosaurs are going to be moving with their limbs, and the mosasaurs are going to be swimming with their main body axis. All right, so now how do terrestrial animals swim? So I showed how terrestrial animals walked, and I showed how aquatic animals swim, but what about land animals? Land animals can swim. There's 2 examples right here. So when you look at swimming in terrestrial amniotes, this is appendicular swimming. The dog is doing this kind of modified terrestrial gait. It's paddling, dog paddling, classically. And then this lizard, which has a sprawling posture, doing something very different from the dog. It's folding its limbs to the side, and it's moving with its tail. It's swimming with axial locomotion in the water as a terrestrial animal. So even before these animals evolve into aquatic environments, they already are favoring certain types of swimming styles. And so this was the light bulb motivation I had. I think it was 2015. I was a senior at Rutgers, and I was like, oh, this is really different. And yet all of these groups, have representatives that went to aquatic environments. So I guess my PhD was a very observation-based kind of scientific endeavor, and so this is one of my favorite things when you just look at modern animals. And so I published a review paper 2 years ago kind of summarizing how terrestrial animals swim relative to one another, with the idea that maybe this is influential to their secondary aquatic invasions. And so this is a really fun figure, but even like the bald eagle for letter G, you know, they get downed all the time, especially like a juvenile bald eagle try to pick up a fish and it was too big and then they get stuck in the water. They're not hopeless. They actually row back to shore with their front limbs, so that's going to be appendicular swimming. They're using their limbs to swim. Chickens are also very good swimmers. They kind of float on the water and they paddle underneath like a duck. And like they're genuinely really good swimmers. Surprise, fun fact that chickens are great. And then of course, lizards on the top, they're going to be employing axial swimming, but not exclusively. I've seen videos online of people giving their bearded dragons a bath, and they use a lot of flailing of their limbs. I can't tell if that's because they're stressed or they favor that, but again, it's not very discreet. There's always exceptions, and of course, the classic mammalian paddlers for the panels A, B, C, D. So terrestrial animals already start off swimming differently. So that's definitely going to have an impact on their evolution for the clades, for the groups of animals that continue going on into aquatic environments. And so my main research question is asking, does the way that an animal walks on land impact how it evolves to swim? So that's been my research question for like 10 years. No, 10 years. No, almost. Yeah, actually. And so in my PhD is kind of where I set out to address that. Will I have an answer for you by the end of this? Maybe. So we'll see. Because this appears easy. So don't look at the plesiosaur for this, look at the mosasaur. You're going from a sprawling locomotion, you fold your limbs to the side like the Komodo dragon, and you swim with your tail. Evolution happens millions of years later, boom, you're a mosasaur. That seems very straightforward, right? Sure. Same thing with this. This seems pretty straightforward. An upright animal like a canine, a dog. Pinnipeds are arctoid carnivorans. They're related to canines, bears, raccoons, so something like that. Swimming, like dog paddling in the water, eventually it'll modify its limbs to be like the flippers that a sea lion or a seal has. Sure, that makes sense. That appears easy. But this happened. You have early artiodactyls, of which pigs are artiodactyls, that have that upright posture. They paddle when they swim, but eventually whales became axial swimmers. They became axial undulators. They lost their hind limbs. They swim with their main body axis and a tail fluke. And this happened too. So I mentioned, I'll talk more about plesiosaurs a little bit. Something sprawling is most certainly the ancestor of plesiosaurs. Plesiosaurs are kind of weird. We don't really know where they are in the tree of reptiles. We kind of do, we kind of don't. But we know they're diapsids. We can assume that they were a sprawling reptile ancestrally. So some sprawling reptile gave rise to this appendicular swimmer. That's weird because we've seen how sprawling reptiles swim. They fold their limbs to the side and they swim with their tail. But for whatever reason, plesiosaurs favored this kind of appendicular locomotion. I have some ideas about that, but those are other projects. I'll talk about that for my next Tyrrell Museum invite. But all right, so this is another figure from that review paper. So I kind of did this qualitative, simple observation. Again, nothing really technical. But I said, let's really see across the tree of amniotes, what is swimming what way and what their ancestral posture is. And so we'll zoom in. So don't worry, I know it's a lot of figure. So I've zoomed into the top. This is the mammal side of the tree. So this is going to be all of our mammals. And if you notice here, so appendicular swimming locomotion, that's going to be your limb-based swimming, a lot of orange color. That really dominates this side of the tree. And if you look on the right, it looks like it's associated with a lot of upright mammals because mammals evolve that upright posture. So it's interesting that already here there seems to be a very qualitative correlation between upright posture and appendicular swimming. But there are exceptions. So sirenians there with the top black arrow, which are going to be your sea cows, manatees, dugongs, they eventually evolved to be like whales where they use tail fluke or axial swimming. They also lost their hind limbs. And then, of course, whales eventually became axial swimmers as well. So those are the two groups. There's some combinations that you can see here, but for the most part, a lot of orange, and then a lot of that transition for the sea cows and the whales. So that's kind of weird. But for the most part, the way they started out is going to be upright posture with appendicular swimming. Now, we'll go down to the reptile side of the tree. So again, now we're going to be looking at axial swimming here, dominated by a lot of the blue color. So lots of blue on the reptile side, like very stark difference between the mammal side of the tree and the reptile side. So that's pretty cool, but there's always going to be exceptions, of course. So when you look at kind of dinosaurs or archosaurs, which is weird, and sauropterygians down here, which are going to be plesiosaurs. So Sauropterygia is the group that includes plesiosaurs, the long-necked ones. they record probable shifts in their evolution. So I pointed out that for whatever reason, plesiosaurs evolved to swim with their limbs. They probably ancestrally swam with their main axis, so axial swimming. But then with the dinosaurs, really, I find it very interesting that the dinosaurs are going to be upright postured, and they seem to favor what I would definitely consider appendicular swimming. So in general, there seems to be, again, a very qualitative correlation between upright posture and appendicular swimming. Dinosaurs, again, are these really weird outliers compared to all these other reptiles, and I don't think it's a coincidence that there's a lot of orange here. Turtles are kind of weird. Turtles have a shell. They can't really swim with their axis at all, so that makes sense that they're there, but dinosaurs are there. So again, these are cool qualitative kind of observations made in this review paper. So there's no analysis done. So that really was the next step. And so, right, yeah, surprise arrow. But yeah, so dinosaurs being very appendicular swimming, and then they're upright. But so I wanted to do more than just this kind of qualitative observation. I was getting a PhD. I had to do more. And so the rest of this talk is really going to be a summary on my PhD research. And so I'm really, really excited to share this because I think it's really cool. And your reaction will actually potentially motivate me to finally publish it by the end of this year. So that will be great. So I wanted to do more. How am I going to do more? Well, I wanted to pick clades to look at. So clade is going to be an evolutionary group of animals. And so I'm like, okay, well, I want a clade of evenly spanning animals. I want something a group of comparison that's evenly sprawling, evenly upright. And then for the aquatic versions of these animals, I want something that is definitely going to be axial swimming and appendicular swimming. And I need groups that are well represented in the fossil record, because that's the other challenge. Groups like ichthyosaurs, we know they're swimming. They're super swimmy. We know that. But we actually don't have a lot of terrestrial ancestors of ichthyosaurs, so I can't do that. People always say, oh, don't you study ichthyosaurs? I'm like, oh, I want to, but not in the context of this, because I really need terrestrial representatives. So I ended up picking these 4 groups, and so this is like a simple little matrix here of pinnipeds on the top left. So they have derived appendicular swimming, so derived is just going to be kind of farther away from the ancestor. And then they're ancestrally upright because they're mammals. And so if you go down in the same column, you get to cetaceans, which are also mammals. They're also ancestrally upright, but they differ from pinnipeds in that they're going to have derived axial swimming. So again, I showed the GIF before of the whale undulating with its tail fluke and its spine. And then now I want to look at ancestral sprawlers. So again, we can assume, given their evolutionary affinities that we know of, that plesiosaurs were going to be ancestrally sprawling to some degree, but they have very, very stark derived appendicular swimming with those 4 equal-sized flippers across the clade. And then mosasaurs, which are lizards, definitely ancestrally sprawling, but they have derived axial swimming, where they're swimming with undulations side to side of their big long tails and an up and down kind of moon-shaped caudal fluke for some of them. So these are my 4 groups, but I didn't want to just pick groups that have really derived members. I really wanted the earlier members of these. And the reason why is because if the ancestral terrestrial aspects of these animals is going to impact their evolution, it's going to manifest early because it could easily get overwhelmed down the road. So I'm like, okay, well, I can't look at a very swimmy whale. I can't look at a very swimmy plesiosaur. I can't look at a very swimmy mosasaur, because at that point, the anatomy will probably overwhelm the signal that I'm trying to look for. So I picked kind of the obscure early relatives of all of these clades. So this is an early pinniped, this is an early whale, which kind of shows the walking whale affinities. This thing has legs, that is an early whale. Then early mosasaurs are going to look a lot more like just a lizard, standard lizard that we're pretty familiar with. And then early plesiosaurs, which are going to be these groups called sauropterygians. A lot of these fossils are really common in Europe, which I was very lucky to go see. So these are the representatives, the early kind of semi-aquatic representatives of those 4 groups that I chose. So I tell people, oh, I study, early whales, or plesiosaurs, whales, et cetera, but I am not studying the things that people have in mind when I say those words. So kind of the early ones. And so I'm like, okay, so I picked my 4 clades. Now, what am I going to actually study about them? What am I going to look at? Well, I'm interested in locomotion. And so for me, that made things a little bit easier. It kind of helped me nix part of the animals, not just because they may not be relevant, but if I didn't, then I'd be looking at the entire animal, which is challenging. I didn't look at the neck and head, and you can blame plesiosaurs for that. I think the neck is fully relevant to aspects of locomotion, but because elasmosaurines, like again, Albertonectes, which has the longest neck of any animal, and other long-necked plesiosaurs, it's a little bit, it would mess things up when I compare them to something like a seal, which has a shorter neck, and a mosasaur. So I got rid of the necks and heads, though I do think they're part of the story. Maybe I'll revisit that later. And then notably, I didn't include the ribs. Ribs are also definitely relevant to locomotion, but I had to kind of, you have to make sacrifices when you design a project, really. And so I'm like, okay, well, let's look at the main things that are really moving in locomotion. The vertebrae, the axial column, and then the limbs and the limb girdles. So this is a pinniped that's hanging from the ceiling at the Natural History Museum of LA County, used as an example. And I also was limited by 2D preservation. This is a really incredible specimen in Zurich that I've seen twice in person now to take measurements for. It's called Ceresiosaurus. This is an early sauropterygian, so early relative of plesiosaurs, and it's incredible. I mean, look, the whole body is here. It's preserved in what's called a Lagerstätten, which is a German description of an area of exceptional fossil preservation. And it is exceptional. The problem is that it's in a flat slab. And so it means I can't really take 2D measurements because I don't want to eliminate specimens like this from my study. So it kind of made things easier because I don't have to do complex 3D things, but there's a limiting factor. But so I can, take measurements of the limbs here in a 2D plane. So that's what I ended up having to do. But I was very, very fortunate to be able to work with some of the most beautiful specimens I've ever seen in the world with my research. And so I wanted to look at the appendicular skeleton shown here and here on both a little reptile on the bottom, little early plesiosaur relative, and then that big pinniped. And then I'm going to look at the axial skeleton, just the vertebrae from kind of the top of the trunk, so not including the neck, down all the way to the tail. So that is my data set. It's a lot of data just to start, even with what I eliminated. And so I visited all of these museums all over the world. I know I'm missing some as far as actual specimens goes. Tyrrell's not on here. But I am collecting data as we speak for another project. So again, in the future, you'll see it listed. But for my PhD, these are the museums that I visited. So all over the world, I spent some time in Europe last year kind of wrapping up, collecting kind of final data. And so it's been really, really fun, but a lot, taking a lot of measurements. But there's a limit. So what kind of measurements did I take? I'm comparing mammals and reptiles. So they're really different. So a mammal and a reptile have very, very different anatomy, particularly in the limb girdles. So you'll see here, this is a whale, I think this is a humpback whale. They have a big scapula, so that's the big limb element on the back. So your shoulder blade, that's your scapula, so we all have one. Mammals only have a scapula. We do not have this other element called a coracoid. Coracoid, it's kind of like a chest scapula. It kind of comes and meets in the middle. And so mammals don't have that, reptiles do. But they're obviously super important bones to the way the upper arm is going to move, of course. But they don't have it, so how do I compare things that they don't have? And then the hands and arms and the vertebrae are going to have their own differences too. So I had to set out to come up with a way to compare these two animals that split 320 million years ago. So if you're wondering why are mammals and reptiles so different, they both walk on land, they both breathe air. They went down separate evolutionary paths, again, about 320 million years ago. So I had to kind of reconcile over 300 million years of evolutionary differences in seeking to compare these animals for my work. And so I did that. It's not a perfect system, but it works. I considered what the elements were doing functionally. Like, what is the purpose of this element, even if it's missing? So this is a single scapula for an early whale called Paregocetus, and this is a scapula and coracoid of an early mosasauroid called Portunatosaurus. And so I kind of wanted to know, okay, well, what's the function? What does this element do? It's muscle attachment, surface area. That's really all these elements do. These elements anchor muscles that attach to the upper arm. So I'm able to move my upper arm like this, swirls, kind of like chicken dance for the people on Zoom, because of the muscles that are attached to the scapula, among other elements. And so I just really want to know, well, how much muscle attachment surface area exists? So I just want to know the total pectoral girdle. So I want, the total height, which is going to be this red line here, and then the total width, and then I average them. So that's kind of where I reconciled these major differences in anatomy by kind of uniting across these clades. It's not a perfect system, but it keeps things functionally minded, keeps the big picture intact. And so another element, another set of measurements I wanted to look at are like the lumbar equivalent or the lower back region. The lumbar region, lower back, is really relevant to undulation, terrestrial locomotion. If you see a whale when it swims, it's going to have a lot of up-down movement from the lumbar region. And, lizards don't have a true lumbar region the way a mammal does, but they have kind of these reduced ribs or even like ribless regions that are kind of equivalent. So kind of measured that lumbar equivalent region because it's relevant to eventual axial swimming locomotion, maybe. So this is an Alearctos, early pinniped, early seal relative, and another early mosasaur right here. And then the tails. Tails can be really long or really short, but they're also super important to axial locomotion, right? Anything that's swimming with its axis is swimming with its tail. So I needed a way to compare the tail, but how do you compare a tail that has 20 vertebrae in it with one that has over 100? So I kind of did this basic ratio, caudal flexibility ratio, that's pretty much the length of the tail divided by the number of vertebrae in it as a proxy for flexibility. Not perfect, but I think it worked. And so this is kind of what all of my data looks like. This was a guide that I used when I was traveling and taking the measurements. This will eventually be in the publication, kind of showing. I took count data as well, so how many certain vertebrae there are, how many trunk vertebrae, how many lumbar, tail, etc. So I took a lot of axial measurements of individual vertebrae too, and some broad ones like lengths of these regions. So you can kind of look in here very close, just different elements of a single vertebra. And then, of course, I took lots of appendicular measurements. I love these. These are so much easier than the axial ones because it's just length, mid-length, and widths of these elements. But it was a lot of data to collect. And so I went through, looked at all of these incredible animals all over the world, very privileged to have been able to do this. And then I normalized my characters. That's just a fancy way of saying making them comparable because I was comparing some really big animals with some really tiny ones. I think the smallest animals I had in my data set was going to be a tiny Sauropterygian called a pachypleurosaur, that they're this big. So for people on Zoom, I'm gesturing a foot on the stage. And then some of the bigger animals I looked at were probably some of those early whales, which were, pig-sized, maybe bigger than a small horse-sized animal. And so that's a really huge difference. You're talking about an arm bone that's an inch long, a couple centimeters, compared to one that's much more than that. And so I had to make sure these characters were comparable, and so I did that. And so I don't put this up here to scare people. I just like to show the process because science sounds really romantic and cool and fun. I get to go all over the world and measure things and take photographs, and it's fantastic. But I have to process all of that data. And I always like to joke, this is one sheet. This is just one sheet. There's other sheets that have it. And so I do think it's important to show the process of science and the kind of hard work that goes into it. And I have to tell you, I've probably re-measured a lot of these a few times. So this is always fun to show, and I like it. I get a lot of peace in looking at a really filled in Excel sheet. When it's filled in, before I fill it in, it's not peaceful at all. And then I did my analyses in the statistical software called R. If anyone's familiar with coding, just a little bit, that's all this is, just coding software, something like Python, even HTML, which is a little bit more accessible. R is just a really phenomenal statistical tool that biologists, paleontologists, and ecologists tend to favor. And so again, showing more of it, showing more of the process, again, just to show what coding looks like. But I need to do this because I'm comparing, thousands of measurements and dozens of animals together. And so I always like to show for any kids in the audience, high school students, anyone who wants to be a paleontologist, there are kind of behind the scenes elements that I like to make a little bit more in front of the scenes so you kind of know what goes into these papers, these pieces of science that we all do. It's a lot of work, a lot of technical stuff, but I enjoy it. I'm very happy to be comfortable with coding. It took a little bit. Coding used to scare me. But all right, so then I have these phylogenetic trees. This is a whale phylogeny, not mine, but I use these existing phylogenies to kind of put the animals that I looked at into context with one another. And so this is my own tree that's based on this one. So I kind of took that tree and those relationships, kind of shrunk it down to all the animals I looked at. So these are the ones that I actually had in my data set for early cetaceans. And I did this really cool, borderline magical thing, just kidding, it's just math, called ancestral state estimation. So what I did is I took all of the measurements of these animals, and what ancestral state estimation does, it essentially takes this, I'd like to call it a fancy average, that takes all that data, given the time that they're separate, the time that they are, and it estimates what kind of this ancestor would be right there. I asked it to estimate the ancestor right here at this node, and so it did. And so I called that kind of the ancestral terrestrial ancestor of whales, representing this ancestral terrestrial state for these groups. So I did it for all 4 clades. So these are my cetaceans, my pinnipeds, my mosasaurs on the bottom left, and then the plesiosaurs, sauropterygians on the bottom right. I used these groups that I pointed out called out groups. Those are the highlighted ones. Those out groups are terrestrial, and they anchor my swimming animals in kind of this morphological context. So using those terrestrial land animals, I was able to estimate these ancestral states for these 4 clades. And why would I do that? Because I want to compare how much they're changing from that point in their morphology, in their axial skeleton, in their appendicular skeleton. And so these are the results. I will break it down. Don't worry. I've made this as digestible as it possibly can be. So I got these kind of 3 plots. And so really what this is, so you can see the mosasauroids in blue, sauropterygians green, cetaceans in like that rose color, and pinnipeds in yellow. And so really all this is, my results, is going to be on the left is the amount that they change relative to one another. And on the right is how they change. And the how they change is really important. And so basically the amount that they change relative to that ancestor. So that triangle that I put on the previous slides is anchored per each of these trees, and those dots are the taxa. And so it shows how much these groups are changing, in this case, in the vertebrae from one another. So just at a glance, you can see that the mosasauroids and the cetaceans and the pinnipeds too are changing a lot in their vertebrae, right? Look at what's not changing a lot. Sauropterygians, the plesiosaur ancestors. That's really interesting. And plesiosaurs, of course, are the sprawling ones that didn't swim with their spines, right? Remember, plesiosaurs swim with their limbs. So that's pretty cool. That could be part of the story for why plesiosaurs didn't swim with their spines. Maybe they couldn't change a lot in their spine and had to swim with their limbs. Again, there's so many ideas that I can get out of this. But what's cool is the how they change. So this is total amount, but it can be any direction. Maybe some things are getting smaller versus getting bigger. That's what this does over here. So you can see the colors. If it's on the right side, it means the element is getting bigger, wider, longer. If it's going on the left side, it means the element is getting smaller, shorter, narrower. So even though they change a certain amount, they're changing in really different directions from one another. But in some places, they're changing similarly, which I think is cool. So again, I'm not going to bog you down with that, but that's what these figures are. You can see here, amount that they change on the left, how they change for the forelimb. So again, it looks like the whales, the cetaceans, and the pinnipeds are changing a lot similarly. But in the forelimbs, it seems that mosasaurs and the sauropterygians a little bit less. But again, on the right, you can see that the directions that they're changing may be opposite in some ways. Some of them are getting really, really bigger in certain elements more than others. Some of them are going opposite directions. And then lastly, the same with the hind limb. So again, it's really satisfying to see the mammals and the reptiles kind of favoring each other on sides of the tree. That's good. It means the morphological analysis does recognize that they're different and that they're mammals versus reptiles. And then the hind limb again. So you can see lots of change in the pinniped hind limb over the course of the space compared to, say, mosasauroids, maybe a little bit less. Again, relative to one another. This doesn't mean they didn't change a lot. If they're smaller than the other, it means they changed less than the ones that change more. And so with regards to this question, I said I might have an answer for you at the end. Does the way an animal walks impact the way it evolves to swim? Well, I did a really simple test to see if that works. So is the total amount of change correlated with ancestral terrestrial posture? So I did a little correlation test. And these are the numbers I got. If the number's closer to 1, it means yes, it is correlated. In this case, it looks like the forelimbs seem to be correlated with ancestral terrestrial posture, followed by the hind limbs. So the limbs are pretty favoring. So the limbs, the limbs change does seem to be correlated with their posture, upright versus sprawling. The spine, the axial column, not so much, which is interesting, kind of 0.72. But that's still pretty high. So answer to this, I said maybe I'll have an answer for you, and indeed, maybe this is related. So that's kind of a nice generic summary of one chapter of my PhD. And so the thing about what I've done and the work I've done is there's lots of different things that you can get from those plots. I show them to various scientists all over, and they're like, oh, maybe it means this, maybe it means that. That's why I haven't published it yet. It's a lot to go through. But either way, with regardless of what my results show, these things had really incredible transformations. And I hope that this talk kind of gave an interesting glimpse into kind of the more technical side of these secondarily aquatic amniotes, that maybe you'll look at a seal, a whale, or a mosasaur in the gallery a little bit differently in the context of their terrestrial ancestry. So with that, I'd like to thank my institutions and my funding sources, and I was really happy to give this talk. I think I'm perfectly on time, and thank you.